Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jonathon Karp. I'm Executive Director of Asia Society Southern California, which is the LA arm of the Global Asia Society. It's based in New York. I am proud to say that one of my colleagues at Asia Society is Wendy Cutler, who helped negotiate TPP, and it makes me feel quite insecure that I'm up here and she's not. But in any case, I've got two great speakers to talk about it. There's a lot of anticipation and I don't want to say hype about TPP. It was a long time coming, and now that it's passed, there's a lot of immediate analysis about its implications and its prospects and its intent. One thing that I hope we will be able to break down in this panel is exactly what it is and how it will affect Australian-US relations, the economies, and the region. I will say, as a former journalist, the two things that I most dreaded covering were labor disputes and trade agreements, because I couldn't even read, during the negotiations of trade agreements, you don't know what's the text and what's the commentary, and the commentary usually outweighs the text by about 10 to 1. But fortunately, we have two speakers who come at this subject from different angles. First, Ambassador Jeff Bleich was very involved with the negotiations of TPP when he was ambassador to Australia. You heard him introduced in the previous panel, but the reason he's here is because he's been there since square one, really. And Jennifer Nason is on the business side. She is managing director and global head of the Telecom, Technology, Media, and Telecom Investment Banking practice for JP Morgan. Originally from Australia, she has experience in mergers and acquisitions, lots of different international businesses. And so she is on the practitioner side who will see the benefits and the implications for business of TPP. So welcome to both of you. If I could start with you, Jeff, since you were there from the inception, one of the big headlines about TPP and its significance is that it represents 40% of the global economy, yet that's not where it started. So if you could perhaps give us a little context to help us understand other descriptions and misperceptions about TPP.
TPP is now, there are all sorts of revisionist histories about it, but when it first got started, it was a reaction to the failing of what appeared to be the failing of the Doha round in the World Trade Organization to have a global trade deal. And so a few nations were casting around saying, well, maybe we could do something which is more regional among some like-minded countries that want to create free trade zones, and then over time these could be stitched together, they could create some momentum, but the Doha rounds had really stalled out at that point. Australia, through APEC, had already been engaged in some conversations about this Trans-Pacific Partnership, and kind of nudged the US that this might be a good one to get involved in. And it was really Australia's leadership on it that led to what's occurred now, because the U.S. saw this as a potential. But at the time, it was Chile, Peru, Burma, not Burma. I'm sorry, Brunei. Very different country. Right. Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. I think it was 8 countries, and apart from the U.S. and Australia, who had substantial, G20 economies. The rest were relatively modest economies, and it was kind of mocked when it was first proposed as an important effort by the United States. It was, the U.S. and the coalition of the willing, coming together for a modest trade deal. The U.S. has really scaled back its ambitions, but we plugged away at it, and over the course of a couple years, people started to see this as a very credible trade deal, and it drew interest from Canada, Mexico, eventually Japan. And once you added those economies into it, then you had a trade deal which, as people have said, nearly 40% of the world's GDP, all in a single trade group. That made other groups pay attention, including China, including Korea, including other nations, either because they thought they'd like to join, but they didn't know whether they could do it yet. Philippines would have to change its constitution, and there'd be some other things that other countries would have to do. But China developed its own countervailing trade agreement, RCEP, mostly with ASEAN countries. And that kind of gave additional lift to TPP in the sense that, well, we must be onto something because other people are imitating it. And so it grew relatively quickly, concluded probably ahead of when people would have expected, and is now out for ratification by the various parties to it. So that's kind of its quick history. But the notion that it originally started as some monolith, or that it was an attempt to contain China, or any of the other narratives that you hear, just, history demonstrates they're not true.
Just to follow up on that, it may not have started with the intention of containing China, but certainly there is this, whether or not Australia and the US state this, other members of TPP perhaps like that aspect of it. What, therefore, do you see as, what is the implication in that case of TPP on China, particularly now that China's economy is looking weaker and the financial system is very volatile?
Well, I don't see it containing China. As I said, China can strike its own deal with other parties to the TPP, or it can join the TPP, or it can develop RCEP, and eventually the two agreements can find some common ground and merge all of the parties. I mean, there are lots of ways in which this engages China more in trade, and I think that's a very positive thing. The one thing that it does constrain about China is that TPP is designed to have some sort of standard rules of the road, in terms of protection of intellectual property, in terms of allowing data to flow freely across borders, in terms of having consistent marketing standards, so that you don't build in tariffs, and you don't make unduly burdensome labeling requirements, and you do other things that make it more efficient to trade across borders. All those things, are just basic rules of the road for how we will trade. And to the extent that you want to dictate your own terms independently without other countries being able to weigh in, you'll be frustrated by trade agreements. But I think the overall view is that the Asia-Pacific will rise together if better, faster, and more resiliently if we do have common rules of the road. And so TPP starts that process, RCEP starts that process, and hopefully this is the beginning of a long and happy story.
Right. So Jennifer, Jeff just mentioned IP and data flow. So your practice relies a lot on those protections for deals without even having to know specifically about the provisions in TPP for that. How do you see this kind of regime influencing investment activity both ways, and business between all of the TPP members?
Well, first, thank you for having me here and letting me be on this panel as the humble investment banker in the room. Just on the point of containing China, just for a moment, I don't think anybody really wants to contain China. I don't think that the TPP is designed to contain China. It may have started that way. I don't believe that mindset today. I totally agree that sort of trying to set the rules, and then as others join, potentially China, that's the basis for the discussion. How are we going to engage with each other? But I do think that the agreement references a couple of things on the technology side that I think are just very profound, which speak to how data around the world is going to flow, where is it going to be stored, who's going to be responsible for that. in-region storage of data versus allowing data to flow around the world, telecommunications and making sure, again, that there's an efficient system globally to communicate. And there's a lot said about that in the agreement, but when the rubber hits the road, we'll have to see ultimately how all of this plays out. But issues like data storage, for example, in a world where data analytics is just going to be a big part of the future, taking your data. So at JP Morgan, we have volumes and volumes and volumes of data that we don't actually have the capacity to analyze right now, but in the future we'll be able to do that to drive incremental business lines and to understand our customers and so forth much better. Having that data, where that data resides, who has the data centers, who's in control of that information, what are the requirements and access for government and so forth is going to be very important. And then just back to the China issue, I don't think I need to tell people in Los Angeles that, Wanda, big Chinese company, just bought Legendary Pictures. And I think, one of the things we've got to watch with China here is it's not just access to Chinese markets, which has been the focus for the last 10 years, but it's Chinese capital increasingly going outbound to other parts of the world. And they've become very, very savvy investors, participants in auctions that we run for assets here and other parts of the world. So again, I would hope over time that China becomes part of this whole trade dialogue, because they're just, irrespective of what's going on in the market, they continue to be the force that we're almost focused on.
Well, and let me pick up on that point, because Wanda buying Legendary, what are they buying? They're buying intellectual property assets, creative assets. It gives them an incentive to have rules. Now, do you think that both and either could answer, but particularly since there is this interest in Chinese investment in the media and tech world, particularly in the West and Australia as well, is that going to accelerate this engagement? Is that what it's going to take for China's economy to be able to reform, make the necessary reforms to join? Is that enough motivation?
Yeah, it's a tremendous motivation, and the U.S. went through a very similar process as it grew. It's a story that Americans don't like to tell about ourselves, but it's the truth, so I'll tell it. We were shameless about stealing copyrighted materials from England, and we only recognized copyrights by American authors. So American authors hated it because people had to pay more for American works than anything from London. And Charles Dickens hated it because people all over the United States were reading his work and no one was paying for it. So he actually came and gave a tour of the U.S. telling us we were a bunch of thieves and to knock it off. And then eventually we had so much intellectual property and so many great writers that we thought, well, we don't want other countries doing that to us. And so not only did we start respecting copyrights from other countries, but we started leading efforts for worldwide copyright protections. I think you see the same evolution in China. China has not been the best global citizen in terms of respect for other nations' intellectual property, but as they have more patents, as they're developing more of their own intellectual property, it's just a natural outgrowth that they will be more committed to legal regimes to protect that intellectual property, and I see that as a positive development. And we can throw some stones now, but we've got some windows in our house. So.
Yeah, self-interest is a wonderful thing. When they get concerned about protecting their own original content and IP and so forth, I suspect they'll gradually, come to the table on a lot of these issues.
And have you seen in deals you've looked at, been involved in, involving Asia or the US and Asia, Australia and Asia, that this has been a sticking point with China, that if there had been, that it falls apart on concerns about data or copyrighted material or protection of intellectual property?
Well, it certainly has and will continue, I think, on core elements of sectors like telecommunications and so forth. There are assets and deals I've worked on where there was interest from Chinese buyers, but you just knew there was no chance of getting that through CFIUS and just regulatory scrutiny. But coming in and buying either 100% or minority interests in content assets, I think, and the sort of creative side, I think is a key focus. So a year ago, I can tell you, if we were selling a media business, we would not have had a Chinese buyer on our sort of target buyers list. Today, they're in the top 5 every time. And there are...
Four of the top 5.
Or 4 of the top 5, depends on the deal. And whether it's just, sovereign wealth funds, Chinese sovereign wealth funds, or actual companies, whether Tencent and Baidu and names like this, I think we're going to see more action. And I think the entertainment space and the content space is a key focus for them right now.
And
just to pick up on that, I think you're exactly right. Things are trending well in certain areas. I think the biggest inhibitions, sort of if you're looking for the headline areas where it's hard for China to sign up to TPP right now. One is the cross-border data flows, the free flow of information. China still relies very heavily on censoring and filtering of the internet and limiting what's available within China to Chinese citizens. And for that reason, that would be a shift in current policy in terms of thinking about how you open up the internet to your population. I think the second issue is probably state-owned enterprises, which are also constrained in in TPP so as not to give them an advantage over private enterprise, and so again that would require some shifting in how China has structured some of its major economic forces, and I think that will be the biggest challenge long term. A lot of the other stuff I think could be worked out just through some hard negotiation.
Mm-hmm. And let me ask specifically about the U.S. and Australia's view of TPP, because it does seem, obviously, with China's economy faltering, that Australia's bet on commodities or whatever it's got to change, and there's a lot of focus on innovation and exporting innovation. So, how do you think TPP will catalyze it, and in which directions?
Well, I guess, so I can answer it on a high level, which is, and particularly as it relates to technology. Mm-hmm. Technology is probably the most global sector in the world today. I mean, we think of natural resources, but I think today technology is probably the most global sector. All of the companies that I deal with in technology, many of the big ones in the US, have most of their operations, produce most of their profit, have more of their customers abroad than they have them in the United States. So I think, for me, TPP sort of just is an acknowledgement of the reality of the true globalization of the economy, that I think certainly when you sit in the United States, you can actually forget that is the reality that we're living with. I think the 5 largest tech companies in the US have $500 billion just parked offshore that they can't repatriate because of, they don't want to pay the freight on the tax side. That just speaks to the amount of business that's just being done all over the world. So whether TPP catalyzes anything in particular, I'm not sure, but I think it's an acknowledgement that the world is an incredibly interconnected place today, and I think it's really important to break down barriers to make sure we have as much free flow of goods and services, information, opportunity for growth, as everybody around the world running a business is anxious to find growth in any pocket of the world that they can find it right now.
No, I think it does catalyze our economies, and it also engages more of the world's economy in a way that will benefit them and us. And in particular, when you think about, the U.S. economy has largely been based on internal consumer demand. Americans buy a lot of stuff. And you can actually, I don't know if other people are feeling this, but I feel like there's sort of a buyer's fatigue now. People are renting storage spaces to put the junk that they don't know what to do with in their house anymore, and so now they're paying for storage charges for stuff that they don't even look at, and then people give them stuff, and they're like, oh, what am I going to do with this? There's this kind
That's
of, right? There's this kind of, we're kind of maxed out on our stuff, and what we're really looking for is what other markets out there, what other middle-class people have the same middle-class tastes that we have and want to buy these things. And the great rise of the middle class is going to be in Asia, in the Indo-Asia region. And so creating stronger relationships there, more opportunities for trade will, I think, move us from too much of an internally focused economy to one which exports more. And I think that will strengthen us, strengthen the region. And then they'll have to buy storage units for all their excess stuff. I think the flip side of this is what happens if there weren't TPP.
Right.
And I think that would be a very, very damaging blow to U.S. credibility if we weren't able to consummate this after driving everyone else to do it. And someone's going to have a big trade deal in this region, and they're going to set rules, and it would be someone else's rules. The U.S. wouldn't be part of it. So I think now we're at a point where the alternative is untenable, not to have a Trans-Pacific partnership.
And look, I do agree that, Asia has been the great hope of new markets and big populations, and there's been bumps in that road to sort of realise some of those objectives. But with everybody walking around with a smartphone, we don't even call them smartphones, they're just phones now. I think there are large parts of Asia that are just going to avoid the sort of build-up of infrastructure that, say, the US went through. And we're going to be able to, they're not going to need fixed line anything, they're not going to need cable, they're not going to need fibre, they're not going to need whatever it is. They're going to be able to go straight to getting everything on a cell phone, because everybody around the world, even in poorer countries, have cell phones. And so I think the sort of realisation of the dream of the ability to drive growth in some of these countries is here. And I think that's why these trade agreements are important. I've never seen so much attention on the part of US companies in how to do business in Indonesia, or how to do business in, and they really, there's a lot of education that needs to go on for some of these companies. But the fact that they're doing the work to really understand how to deliver content, for example, if you're a media company in Indonesia, is fascinating to me. And that's all been in sort of the last 12 months or so.
And I guess I've heard it described, obviously, the TPP is a trade deal for the 21st century. This focus on IP, so we're talking about technology and content and information flow, the information age. But also, Jeff, you pointed out in our talk before this about other aspects, labor standards, environment, things that have been touched on other trade agreements, but are those elements stronger and sort of precedent-setting in TPP?
Yeah, no, these are the best labor standards and environment standards that we've developed, and that is, that's a positive for the world as well. It means that we're sharing this planet, and we like to think that what we do within our own boundaries is our business, but clearly it isn't. It's all part of one massive ecosystem, and I think climate change and carbon emissions and a lot of other things that we've had with overharvesting of oceans and acid rain. We're starting to see that environmental degradation doesn't respect borders. So we need to be operating across lines with other countries in terms of environmental standards. In terms of labor, not only is it unfair to some economies to have their economy suffer because other countries are willing to exploit their people, but in terms of reducing the risk of great destabilizing revolts, treat people fairly. pay them a decent wage for decent work. And that has always been a good way of stabilizing regions and leading to rising economies and strengthening countries as a whole. So those are critical pieces, and even dispute resolution in the agreement is very encouraging. I mean, arbitrations have always been done a little bit in the shadows. It's private, no one can watch. Even the decision can be secret.
And you're an arbitrator, aren't you?
Yeah.
You were.
Yeah, no, then that's why people pay me, to keep their secrets.
But now you're touting this openness.
Yeah, now we're prying it open. That's what's great about the investor-state dispute provisions. It basically says, this is all going to be done out in the open because it's states involved. So, all of the transcripts will be published, all of the opinions, all of the briefs. There will be appellate rights, things that make it feel more like a trustworthy legal system for resolving disputes. So in every way, I think it's, you see the standards coming up.
Right. I'm happy.